We surveyors can be an odd bunch. We don't wince at spending $40,000 for a 1 second robotic total station, $60,000 for a set of the newest generation RTK receivers, or $120,000 on a 3D scanner. After all, we want to provide the best accuracy possible to our clients. But when it comes to spending a few grand on software that will allow you to get the most out of your $200,000 investment, now those purse strings tighten? Maybe it's the idea of spending on something less tangible or the straw that broke the camel's back. But if I was starting up a survey company on a shoestring budget, I can guarantee the last thing I would cut from that budget is the software I rely on to adjust my survey data in such a way that I know I'm getting the most accurate results possible given the data I have, in obtaining a level of confidence in my data not possible with less rigorous adjustment methods. I'm talking about least squares adjustment software. And what company is generally accepted as the king of the hill when it comes to least squares adjustment? That would be Microsurvey's STARNET. Now, I already have several videos on STARNET explaining why I recommend using it, some of the unique features it has, and how you can use it to combine different measurement types. But today, we're going to go through exactly how to perform an adjustment in the software step by step, so that even if you've never used it before, by the end of today's video, you should not only be able to successfully adjust your survey data, but hopefully have a better understanding of what's going on during the adjustment process. Besides just a typical project walkthrough, I'm also going to highlight some tips and tricks along the way that I've picked up over the years, and some new ones that were given to me from some of the experts over at STARNET. If you're currently exporting points out of your data collector as is with no post-processing, or even relying on simplistic adjustment methods such as the compass rule adjustment, do yourself a favor and stick around for this video. In today's video, we are going to run through some data I collected a couple of weeks back. In the field, I set up my total station on an assumed coordinate and orientation and ran a relatively short traverse of about 1,600 feet or 500 meters around a few buildings at a public park down here in Winter Garden, Florida. I returned the next afternoon to take some RTK measurements using Florida's public GNSS reference station network, the FPRN, run a level loop, and make some additional total station ties to tighten up the traverse. This site will actually be used in an upcoming video where I'll be setting up a friendly traversing competition between any local survey crews that wish to participate. So if you're local to Central Florida and would like to get together and hopefully teach me some of your techniques that you've learned over the years, have a friendly competition and chat about surveying, send me a message on LinkedIn. There are a lot of nuances to how one can traverse, and by directly comparing a variety of methods, equipment choices, and techniques on the same site under the same conditions, maybe some conclusions will start to make themselves apparent, and we can all learn a little and benefit from it. Enough talk, let's jump into STARNET and process some data. We'll start off by opening STARNET and creating a new project. A default DAT file is created automatically every time you make a new project. A DAT file is basically just a text file that STARNET can read, often containing input data for your survey network. They can be toggled on and off in the files tree on the left side of the screen. When toggled off, they will be excluded from the adjustment. They can also be moved up and down using these arrow keys, and by doing this, you can change the order in which the data is processed. This default DAT file currently has no effect on the network adjustment because the text contained within it is currently turned off, so to say. Not through checking or unchecking that DAT file in the files tree, but these comment symbols or hashtags are essentially telling STARNET to treat the line they preface as a comment and not actual input data. The shortcut to add or remove the comment symbol is Shift 3, which can be applied one at a time or you can highlight multiple lines of text and use the Shift 3 to comment them all out at once. This default DAT file is also making use of two inline operators. An inline operator is a text-based command that affects the processing of subsequent data in either that particular DAT file or subsequent DAT files for the remainder of your entire project, depending on the operator. They can change data formats, modify error handling, define aliases, or control how GNSS vectors are processed, among many other operations. They are prefaced by a period sign and will show up as pink text. These two inline operators are essentially performing the same action as adding a hashtag to each line they encapsulate. The first one is turning all the following input data off or removing it from the adjustment, and the second one is ending that initial command and telling STARNET to start processing the input data underneath it. I can move the data off command down a few rows, and now those data input lines above it are now active and I can run an adjustment. I can also move the data on operator a couple of lines up, and it will activate any input data below it. This example input data is typical of what we will see when we import actual raw total station data exported from our data collectors. They start with a data code that tells STARNET what kind of data to expect after it. For example, I can hover over the D and I'm told this is a distance measurement. I can hover over the 1 to 2 and see these denote the from to point names. And I can hover over the 100.01 and see this is a horizontal distance. So if I wanted to read this input data and figure out what was done in the field, I can hover over any portion of it and STARNET will tell me what it means. For example, coordinate values of 1000, 1000 were entered for point 1. A backsight bearing between points 1 and 2 was defined as 0 degrees, and a distance of 100.01 meters was observed to point 2. Then, while set up at 1, backsighting 2, and foresighting 3, a horizontal angle of 90 degrees and a horizontal distance of 100 meters were observed, so on and so forth. Data codes will change based on how the data was collected in the field and what field software was used, but they can all be decoded very easily by hovering over each field to see what it means. Now, this default DAT file is great because it comes with this example data that new users can play around with, but it's wasted space for a familiar operator that's looking to do production work. I could simply highlight everything and delete it, or delete this default DAT file altogether. But I do like to keep a separate DAT file at the start of my projects where I can leave comments, input the job number and name, make notes of who captured the data in the field and who is processing the data, etc. So instead of clearing this page out and manually typing in the fields I want to use for every job, I can edit this default template so that every new project has the same custom template DAT file going forward. The template file location is denoted right here, and when we navigate there in Windows File Explorer, we can open and edit it or any other STARNET related DAT file in Notepad. Now, every new project going forward will start off using our new default DAT template file. The next step before importing our survey measurements is to set up our project options. There are a lot of settings that can be adjusted here, and it would take too much time to explain every single one, but the main ones we need to set up first and foremost are our units, the adjustment type if we're using an assumed local coordinate system or a grid mapping projection, which geoid to use if we have GNSS measurements, and our instrument specifications. For this dataset, we're running a 3D adjustment because we're carrying elevations. We'll start off using a local coordinate system because on the first day I used an assumed coordinate and orientation for my initial setup point, and we'll ignore the geoid until I bring in the RTK measurements on the second site visit. As for the instrument settings, most of these values are derived from the spec sheet of the instrument used. I used a 1-inch focus 35 robotic total station, and if I look at the spec sheet for this instrument, I can see it has an ISO 17123-4 value for the EDM of 1 mm plus 2 ppm to a prism, and an ISO 17123-3 value of 1 arc second for a dual face direction measurement. So I need to enter 1 millimeter or 3,000ths of a foot for the distance constant and 2 ppm for the distance ppm. For the angular values, we need to consider that the quoted ISO value on the instrument spec sheet is for a dual face direction observation, not an angle, which is actually the difference between two direction pointings. When I import my raw data, I have the option of importing each individual direction measurement split up or letting STARNET average them during the import process. I prefer to keep every direction separated so I can evaluate the splits between faces. When I do this, the error propagation that STARNET runs needs to apply the correct standard deviations for a single face direction observation. And since the ISO spec sheet is for a dual face observation, we need to do a bit of manual error propagation of our own. I wrote a white paper that walks you through some basic error propagation of total station measurements that I will link in the description of this video. But essentially, we need to take that 1 second ISO value and multiply it by the square root of 2 because a dual face observation makes use of 2 single face observations. This gives us a standard deviation of 1.4 seconds for a single face direction observation on a 1 second instrument. And for the angle value, we multiply that calculated value by the square root of 2 again, because like previously mentioned, an angle is the difference of two directions, each of which is carrying their own uncertainty. This gives us a standard deviation of 2 seconds for a single face angle measurement on this 1 second instrument. For the zenith value, it's not quite as straightforward. A zenith angle is the difference between a vertical direction measurement and the direction of gravity that is determined at the setup point. So we need to factor in that 1.4 second standard deviation of a direction pointing and how accurately we can define gravity at that point. If we look back at our instrument spec sheet, we can see that our automatic level compensator has an accuracy spec of half an arc second. After a little bit of math, we can determine that we have a zenith angle standard deviation of 1.7 seconds for a single face vertical angle measurement. The elevation difference values only come into play if you're manually entering 3D data in the form of horizontal distances and vertical differences, which in my experience is extremely rare. These can be ignored for the vast majority of applications. Centering errors are more difficult to directly calculate. For the horizontal values, it's basically asking, how confident are you that you're horizontally directly above the points your instrument and target are set up on? The vertical value is asking how confident you are that the measure up of your HI or HT is correct. There are a lot of different factors that come into play in these three boxes that probably could have been split up into several different fields. What is the bubble sensitivity of your triback or rod bubble? What is the HI or HT? Are you using force centering control points such as a magnail? Are you measuring your HT to the side of the prism using a height hook or a fixed height prism pole? In the error propagation program I wrote, Survey Buddy, I did make the effort to consider these different factors, but some could make the argument that it was overkill. You'll need to try to determine your confidence of your measure-ups and your horizontal centering. You could sit down and do some calculus to come up with some fairly accurate numbers, or you can just estimate a value. Since I personally always use some version of force centering for my control points, measure my HIs with a metric tape which allows for a higher degree of precision, use fixed height rods, and always check and calibrate my high sensitivity plumb bubbles before I start a high accuracy control network, I can feel confident about entering in 1 millimeter or 3,000ths of a foot for all three fields. If you are too optimistic with these values, it will show up later once we start to adjust our data. Our project settings are now at a point where we can start importing data, but we'd rather not have to go through that process for every single job. If you instead adjust the company options, all your settings will be saved on your computer and remain the same for every subsequent STARNET project you start going forward. And if you wish to share these company options, you can grab the company.def file that can be found in the same folder as your template DAT file we adjusted earlier and share it with the other members of your company so that everyone is starting each adjustment with the same settings. And one other tip regarding the instrument settings. If you adjust data for multiple crews that use different total stations with different field methodologies, you can use STARNET's instrument library to create profiles of each piece of equipment for each crew, and to load in a different equipment profile, you use an inline operator at the start of your DAT file to do so. This could even be built into your template if desired. We are now ready to import the raw survey measurements we exported from our data collector. Since STARNET is brand agnostic, we have a large array of different data formats we can convert and import. Trimble, Topcon, Leica, Field Genius, Carlson, etc. You can even mix and match manufacturers in the same project. We'll be adjusting data collected using Trimble Access, so I'll need to click the Input dropdown and choose Job XML Converter. Navigate to the JXL I exported from my data collector, and with the newest version of STARNET, the output location will automatically be in the same root folder that I saved my STARNET project in. I have the option to import all observations or average observations from my conventional data. Like I mentioned earlier, I like to keep every direction separate, so I'll choose all observations. If you'd prefer to let STARNET average observations before importing them, you'll need to adjust your instrument settings and select average observations, but I personally do not recommend it. I can also simultaneously import any GNSS measurements that are present in the JXL. This first JXL we are going to import only has total station measurements. Once you have your input data selected and your desired settings, click the Import button. There are a few inline operators that were brought in from the JXL, so in this case, even if I made a mistake on some of our project settings, they should be overridden by these functions. If we try to adjust the network as is, we'll get a few error messages. Currently, there is no coordinate defined for the starting point of the traverse, even though we entered a value in the field of our setup point 100. By default, those coordinate values of the control points come in commented out. Let's uncomment the starting point for 100, still nothing. While we have defined 100, we haven't given that initial coordinate standard deviations to define how confident we are in its location. The input line prefixed with a C is called a C record, which is essentially defining coordinates for that point name. If we click it, we will get a pop-up that shows us what data STARNET is expecting to see, and it's now clear we are in fact missing values to define the standard deviations of the northing, easting, and elevation. We will start off by holding this point as fixed, which we can do by using what STARNET refers to as a fixity symbol for each axis. In this case, the fixity symbol will be the exclamation mark, which fixes the values it's associated with. When we fix a point or measurement, we are telling STARNET to hold these coordinate values and process a network so that these values will not be adjusted. We can now run the adjustment, and when the network processes successfully, we get a processing summary on the left side of the screen that shows us how many measurements were taken, the error factor for each type of measurement, and whether or not the data passed the chi-squared test, which is a test done to compare how well the actual observed measurements fit the adjusted measurements. When evaluating the error factor values, we are looking for numbers that approach a value of 1. If the number is lower than 1, it means the measurements fit better than expected, considering the instrument settings that we entered. If the number is above 1, that means the opposite is true, and if the error factor is significantly higher than 1, there may be a blunder present in the data. This is handy to give you a quick overview of the network adjustment. At first glance, it appears all of our data looks good. The directions and zenith angles are hovering around 1, and the distances are significantly under 1. But we need to do more of an investigation into each individual measurement to make sure there aren't any problem measurements hiding in the data. These processing summary error factor values are looking at all 228 direction, distance, and zenith measurements as a whole, and it's quite possibly there are one or two lower quality measurements hiding in the data that are throwing out one or more of the control points. What I like to do is go back into my project options, click on the listings file tab, and make sure to assort adjusted observations and residuals by standardized residual. The standardized residual is the measurement's residual, or the difference between the observed measurement and the network adjusted measurement, divided by the estimated precision of that measurement. It's basically normalizing the residual to allow us to quickly look at this value and estimate the quality of the measurement. If we see a value of 1, we know that measurement's residual is about what it was expected to be, similar to the error factor values we just looked at. When we get into values approaching 3, in other words, the measured residual is 3 times larger than what was expected, we need to start doing some investigation to see if we can confidently assume there is error in that measurement above what can be considered normal random error. And if we have enough redundancy, remove that lower quality measurement. Let's go over on the Output tab on the right side of the screen and click on the Listings tab. This holds all the metadata about our adjustment: the project settings used, the measurements made, the adjustment statistics, the adjusted coordinates and their standard deviations and error ellipses, and the adjusted observations and their standardized residuals, which we just sorted in descending order. This brings the observations with the highest relative residuals to the top of the list. Our poorest quality distance measurement saw a residual of 0.003 of a foot, or 1 millimeter, or in other words, the actual measured slope distance between the observation on file line 2237, which we can double click to jump to, was 0.003 of a foot different than the calculated slope distance determined after all the coordinates had been adjusted. STARNET was expecting to see up to 0.005 of a foot, or 2 millimeters, of difference between the measured value and the adjusted value, so we really only used up about 60%, or 0.6 of the predicted error budget of that measurement. But where did that 0.005 of a foot come from? It was calculated using error propagation equations and the instrument specs we input earlier. If I go back into my project options and change my centering values, or my instrument EDM quality values, that 5,000th value will change. For example, if I say I can actually center my instrument and target perfectly, then that calculated distance standard error will be based almost entirely off of the distance constant and the distance ppm values we entered from our instrument spec sheet, and therefore that value will significantly decrease. We can now see that the distance performed worse than expected, not by much, but if we look over at our processing summary, we can see we are now reporting big problems with our direction and zenith angles. This is one reason it's very important to use realistic values for your instrument settings. Let's change those all back to 1 millimeter and move on to evaluating our zenith angles for issues, as there doesn't appear to be any issues with our measured slope distances. We can now see we do have some rather large standardized residuals for our zenith measurements. Anything with a value over 3 gets flagged with an asterisk, letting us quickly see there may be issues with that measurement. If we look at the worst vertical angle measurement, we can see there is a residual of 16.6 seconds, which if turned into a distance vector by multiplying the slope distance by the sine of 16.6 seconds, we get 0.023 feet. STARNET was expecting to see 3.51 seconds, which means we have 4.7 times more error than was expected for this measurement. If we double click the file line of this measurement, it highlights the measurement in the imported DAT file. Right off the bat, we can see the phase 1 and phase 2 vertical angles don't add up to 360. They're about 15 seconds shy. The other 3 points measured in this set all had their dual face vertical angles add up to within 1 to 3 seconds. So I already have some evidence that this measurement is an outlier. And since I took 5 rounds at this setup, I can look at the other 3 values for that exact same observation and compare them, knowing they should be identical plus or minus random error. I can see from my listings file the adjusted zenith angle was 90 degrees, 13 minutes, and 53.1 seconds, and the problem observation was 90 degrees, 13 minutes, 36.5 seconds. If I look at the other rounds, I have vertical angles ending with 56.2, 55.6, 57.2, and 56.9 seconds, all of which are very consistent and much closer to the adjusted value of 53.1 seconds. At this point, I can confidently say there was an issue with that first vertical angle measurement. I can't say why exactly, but it's definitely an outlier that is skewing our data. To remove it, I can comment it out by highlighting it and pressing Shift 3 on my keyboard. If I have the redundancy, which I do in this case, I like to remove both faces of any problem observations. As we know, dual face observation removes some forms of systematic error, and I'd rather not wonder if I'm reintroducing systematic error by only removing one face in case the instrument was imperfectly calibrated for collimation or there was some compensator index error at the time of data capture. When I readjust the network, we can see the error factor for the zenith angle dropped quite a bit, and we are now below 1.0. If we go back and look at the adjusted vertical angle from 106 to 105, we can see it changed from 90-13-53.1 to 90-13-53.8 because it didn't have that one measurement dragging it down. If we look at the now lowest quality vertical angle measurements, they're closer to 3, and I usually like to investigate anything over 2.5. And at this point, it's rinse and repeat as far as the investigation process. I'll do the same thing over and over again until I'm confident I removed any problem measurements skewing our data. Now, that doesn't mean I'll have to remove the remaining 5 observations that are all over 2.5. As I remove the worst ones, the whole network is recalculated, and it's possible it's just one of these observations throwing the other 5 out. A tip when you're doing this: by commenting out an entire observation, you're getting rid of a potentially acceptable direction and distance measurement where it could just be the vertical angle or HI or HT that was bad. To avoid this, we can apply a fixity symbol or set values for all our measurements. For example, I could say this particular vertical angle should have a standard deviation of 20 seconds, or better yet, I'll use the ampersand fixity symbol to tell STARNET to use the value from our project settings for the direction and distance observations and the asterisk symbol for the vertical angle measurement. That asterisk will essentially let that vertical angle float with no weight on the adjustment. In other words, it's basically ignoring the vertical angle measurement but keeping the distance and direction observations. Another quick tip: you can use Shift and Alt at the same time on your keyboard to extend your text cursor vertically or diagonally in STARNET. This can be handy when editing and copying or pasting multiple rows. As you do your error propagation, it's a good idea to comment out measurements you want to remove entirely instead of deleting them, to track exactly what was done to the raw data, and this way you can decide to bring them back in later if needed. I also like to make notes for myself while making edits so I know why I decided to remove a particular measurement. If you find you made too many edits and forgot what exactly was done and want to start over, you can always delete the DAT file by pressing this X button and re-import your raw data. We're not editing the JXL or raw data we exported from the data collector. We're editing the data file that was converted from it. The error factors have improved and our adjustment is looking good. If I scroll down to the bottom of the listings file or use the listing index tree to jump to the error propagation section, I'll see that this top table contains my coordinate standard deviations separated by northing, easting, and elevation at 68% confidence. This second table is closely related, but it's the coordinate error ellipse at 95% confidence separated by the semi-minor and semi-major axis and elevation. What this table is essentially saying is that we can be 95% confident that the true location of each point will be somewhere within the error ellipse defined by these values and centered on the adjusted coordinates, provided no systematic errors have evaded detection. These values are influenced by both the instrument settings used and the residuals or apparent error in the data. If I introduce a blunder in one of our measurements, we can see that not only do the error factors increase, but the quality of our coordinates significantly decreases. Having these error propagation values is immensely valuable, and it cannot be understated how important this information is. Without these values, we are left trying to qualify our survey data with check shots and traverse closures, which is, in my opinion and many others, a significantly inferior method. Now, these coordinate standard deviations are looking fairly high to me at the moment in the horizontal component, and that's because these values are giving us the absolute or global coordinate quality. What I'm actually interested in is the relative accuracy within the network itself. I'm far less concerned how point 100 falls in global terms, and much more interested in how it relates to point 106 or point 103, for example. If I set up on 106 and lay out some anchor bolts, and then set up on 100 and lay out some other anchor bolts that will hold a beam between the two sets, how well will those anchor bolts fit to each other? To lock this adjustment down, I need to fix that original bearing. Currently, we haven't defined its standard deviation, which means it's using the 1.4 second value we left in the project settings. And that 1.4 seconds over a relatively short baseline is leaving a lot of uncertainty in the network. To fix it, we'll use the exclamation fixity symbol and readjust the network. Now we have a much more realistic idea of the relative accuracy of the network. Now, someone could look at these values and make the argument that if I quoted a 95% error ellipse of 0.105, for example, of having a semi-major of 7 thousandths of a foot or 2 millimeters horizontally and 3 thousandths of a foot or 1 millimeter vertically, this would be overly optimistic. You can't survey to 1 or 2 millimeters, especially with a 10-year-old medium tier total station. Well, error propagation equations of total station measurements are pretty reliable as long as the adjuster knows how to use the software properly. Anyone could fake their adjustments to quote an overly optimistic coordinate standard deviation, but it would be relatively apparent to an experienced eye once the reviewer took a closer look at the error factor results, network plot, and listings file. When you have different measurements to the same point name in STARNET, it knows you're observing the same point and treats the measurements appropriately. For example, when I collected this data, I set up on 106, backsighted 105, and closed out. I used point names 107 and 200, both of which already exist from my initial setup. By using the same point name in the field instead of 107 check, for example, STARNET automatically closed the traverse. But I will now break it apart to see how the traverse closes, just as another piece of information to back up what the error propagation is telling me. To do this, I will use the inline alias name operator. This is essentially telling STARNET to use the number 107 check whenever it sees the point number 107 going forward. It can and often is used in the other direction as well. If the field crew tagged their closing shot as 107 check, I could manually change each instance of that or just use an alias inline operator. Now, instead of pressing the normal adjust network button, this time I will adjust with cluster detection. If any points are within a specified distance of any other points, I will get a pop-up box that tells me the point names and the deltas between points. We can see when we open the traverse, we closed out to 107 at 3 thousandths of a foot or 1 millimeter horizontally and 5 thousandths of a foot or 2 millimeters vertically, and sub-millimeter both horizontally and vertically to 200. These values back up what the error propagation was telling us previously. I'll now go back and comment out those aliases to close the traverse again. So we have an extremely accurate traverse set up in a local coordinate system. What next? Well, as of right now, it's just floating in space somewhere. Let's fix that by georeferencing it with the RTK observations we took on day 2 using Florida's public GNSS reference station network, the FPRN. This time, when we import the JXL from the second site visit, we not only get the additional conventional ties I took, but the RTK GNSS vector measurements as well. If we look at the vector measurements, we can see They're made up of delta XYZ Earth center, Earth fixed Cartesian values, and a covariance matrix that basically tells STARNET what kind of precision that GNSS measurement had, which STARNET uses to both weight each individual observation appropriately and in the error propagation. The first thing we'll do is incorporate the additional total station ties we made on day 2. I'll put a data off inline operator before the GNSS vectors to omit those for now and then run the adjustment. On the surface, everything looks fine from what the error factors are telling us, but whenever we add in new data, we need to repeat the error detection process of looking at the distance, direction, and vertical angle standardized residuals and making sure there aren't any problem measurements. It turns out there isn't, so we're good to move on. We can delete that data off operator and try to process our network with the GNSS measurements, and we get some error messages. If we look back at our project settings, we can see we're still set up for a local coordinate system. We'll need to change that to grid now that we're using GNSS measurements, and since we want orthometric heights, we also need to jump over to the modeling tab and check perform geoid modeling. I've never had much luck with the automatic selection from geoid files option and prefer to point to a geoid file that I downloaded for the area I'm doing the adjustment in. For this adjustment, I'm in Florida, so I'll need the little endian version of Grid 7 for Geoid 18, which can be downloaded from NOAA's website. I've created a folder inside of STARNET's installation folder structure where I can dump the geoid files I need and reference them whenever I want going forward. Now, while we already have the project settings open, let's make one last change. We'll jump over to the GPS tab and check factor supplied standard errors by and enter a value of 2. What this is essentially doing is telling STARNET to take the calculated RTK measurement quality from the covariance matrix we talked about earlier and degrade it by a factor of 2. GNSS is notorious for being overly optimistic about coordinate quality, and by doing this, we're giving STARNET a more realistic idea of what we can expect from our GNSS measurements. If we take a closer look at our GNSS vector measurements, we can see they come from some new point name. This is actually the point name of the base station we received corrections from that is part of the FPRN. And luckily for us, if we scroll up to the top of that DAT file, we can see the coordinates of that base station were automatically imported. So we just need to uncomment its C record and make it fixed just like we did originally for our point 100. And speaking of our point 100, we can no longer hold FPRN's base station fixed in grid and point 100 in an assumed coordinate system simultaneously. So we'll need to jump back into the first DAT file and comment out the C record for 100 and the bearing. When I RTK'd in the traverse hubs, I used different point numbers to make my life easier while collecting data. We can easily adjust for this using that alias inline operator we previously used to break points up. However, this time, we'll be using it to combine measurements instead of separating them. Once we run the adjustment, our traverse has transformed into the georeferenced grid coordinate system we defined in our project settings. To make sure everything worked correctly, we can export a KML to verify we're in the right location in Google Earth. Everything is looking good so far. We now have a new entry in our processing summary for GPS deltas with an associated error factor, and as we can see, our GPS deltas seem to fit the existing network quite well. And again, we can't solely rely on the error factor summary, so we'll go back into the listings file and check out each measurement for any outliers. They all look fine. If we scroll down in the listings file to the error propagation results, we can see there appears to be a massive degradation in coordinate quality. This is because, like we talked about earlier, these values are representing absolute coordinate quality, and since we are now relying on our absolute position and orientation from GNSS observations, we have introduced a lot of absolute uncertainty. If I wanted to know my absolute position coordinate quality, these would be an appropriate reflection of that, but like I said before, I am much more interested in my relative accuracy. All I really need from the RTK measurements for this project is to georeference the traverse and get grid orientation, but I still want to prioritize relative accuracy. I don't think the RTK measurements I took are increasing relative accuracy at all on this particular job, and you could make an argument they are doing the opposite. So that being the case, I'll use the RTK measurements to shift the traverse into place and apply a rotation, then remove them from the adjustment. Just a note, if this were a long linear traverse that I wanted to help tie down with GNSS, I would take a different approach than what I'm about to do. You can see here I have 12 RTK measurements to 6 of the control points that were in the traverse. If I didn't have STARNET, I could have measured 2 control points with RTK, then shifted my traverse to one and rotated to the other. The problem with that method is it's putting all the absolute positional error into a single RTK measured point and the orientation into a single measured baseline. By using more RTK measured points common with the traverse points, I can distribute the error over 6 different points in this case, giving us a significantly better absolute position and orientation. Now that I have my traverse shifted and oriented using these 6 RTK measurements, I can lock it down by grabbing an adjusted coordinate for 100 and making a new C record and grabbing the grid bearing between 100 and 101 and fixing that. I'll comment out the base station coordinate and turn off the RTK measurements as we got all we needed from those and reprocess the data. Now the coordinates haven't really changed at all, maybe a thousandth of a foot here and there, but our error propagation values are back to displaying what we want, the relative coordinate quality of our adjusted and now georeferenced traverse. And one last thing, now that we don't have any raw GNSS measurements in our data, we don't need to apply any geoid modeling, so we can go turn that off in the project settings. In this example, you'll notice some of our RTK observations were directly connected by a total station tie. STARNET can run into issues if you're trying to connect RTK observations or C records to a traverse that doesn't have a direct tie between them or an observation to at least 2 of the points we want to shift our traverse to from the same setup. However, it is not uncommon at all to be in such situations. Let's say you have a long linear traverse with some static GNSS observations at the beginning, middle, and end. It's very possible you won't be able to see 2 of the points that had static observations from a single total station setup. Or using our example data, let's say we didn't have our 6 RTK observations, but instead points 107 and 103 are control monuments I have known coordinate values for. If I hold those as fixed and try to run my adjustment, STARNET cannot resolve the adjustment and I get an error message. Luckily, there is an easy workaround for this. I will assign an initial assumed bearing between one of the monuments with supplied coordinates and a traverse hub that has a direct tie to it and let the bearing float. Now STARNET isn't going to like this because we took a wild guess at the bearing and it's probably way off. But now we have some approximate coordinates we can work with. So I'll open up the network plot, grab a better estimation of that bearing, and reprocess my network. You may want to repeat this a couple of times until that bearing converges. Usually it won't take more than 3 or 4 iterations. As you can see, our error factors are back where they're supposed to be, as are our coordinate values. And remember, we aren't forced to hold those supplied coordinates as fixed. If these were control monuments, you may have a datasheet providing you with the standard deviations of these values, which you can enter in place of the fixed symbol. If I don't have provided standard deviations of the supplied coordinates, I can estimate a value based on how the data was collected. Besides just the additional conventional ties and RTK measurements, I also ran a level loop on the second trip to the site. Conditions weren't really ideal for the level loop, but it closed out to 0.003 of a foot or 1 millimeter. Not great, not terrible for a level loop of this size. We saw that the traverse also closed vertically to about 1 millimeter, but that's just a traverse closure, and I wanted another method to QC the elevations derived from the least squares adjusted traverse, hence why I ran a level loop in the first place. Well, the largest deviation seen between the elevations derived from the level loop and the elevations derived from the traverse was 0.004 of a foot or 1 millimeter, in the average deviation seen was just a single thousandth of a foot or a third of a millimeter. Again, this helps affirm the error propagation values of STARNET were not overly optimistic. When bringing differential leveling data into STARNET, you can either export the raw data from the level or enter the elevations you calculated from your field notes. I usually prefer to do the latter. This is accomplished by E-records, very similar to C-records, but these define elevations only. I have the option to set these elevations as fixed or manually apply a standard deviation. For this situation, I feel a 1,000th of a foot standard deviation is suitable. This puts approximately equal weight on the level loop data as the traverse, and considering they had equal misclosures and agreed to 1,000ths on average, I think that's fair in this situation. We now have a fully adjusted control network. We brought in 2 sets of total station data, RTK measurements, a level loop, and combined them all to make a very relatively accurate control network that is georeferenced. There is just one thing missing to really tie a bow on this data set: ground coordinates. All the data is currently being scaled into grid coordinates because that's what we told STARNET to do by setting a grid coordinate system in the project settings. If you're not 100% clear on the difference between the two, pause this video and watch my grid to ground coordinates video because it's vitally important to fully understand the difference. Luckily for us, one of the best features STARNET has is its ability to calculate grid and ground coordinates simultaneously in a single adjustment. We'll open up the project options, click on the Other Files tab, and check the box next to Create a Ground Scale Coordinate File. Click the drop-down next to Format and select comma separated and click Settings. Here we can choose to either use a specified combined scale factor, have STARNET calculate one for us based on a site-wide average, or calculate it at a specific point. I like to choose the specific point option and scale about that. It makes manually converting between grid and ground outside of STARNET easy. If you wish to apply a rotation, you can do so here. This is really handy if you're working with a local site coordinate system that isn't using grid north and has a specified rotation. And if you wish to shift your ground coordinates, you can do that here. This is often done to truncate your ground coordinates so as to make it very clear to the person being supplied coordinate values in the range of 10,000, for example, that these are probably not mapping projection grid coordinates. For this example, let's shift, rotate, and scale everything back into the initial site assumed coordinate system we started off with. I'll scale about 100, apply a rotation from 100 to 101, holding an azimuth of 0, and shift everything to the original coordinates I entered into my data collector for 100. Now when I readjust the network, I have a new tab appear in the output window titled Ground. These are the scaled or unscaled, depending on how you look at it, ground coordinates of the adjusted points. And what's great about this ground file is it has all the metadata of the grid to ground conversion hard-coded in it. No more guessing as to how someone converted their grid coordinates to ground or vice versa. The network plot and Google Earth export still retain the grid location and orientation. Another handy feature is when you inverse between points in the network plot, it will give you the grid distance and the ground distance. Just over this relatively small site, there's 12,000ths of a foot or 4 millimeters of difference between the two. And even though this is in Florida where we typically deal with very low distortion in our mapping projections, we can see the difference between grid and ground is significantly higher than the error in our traverse. That about wraps up everything we need to do in STARNET. In the same folder that you saved your STARNET project, we can find a PTS, GND, and LST file. All 3 of these are text files that can be opened in Notepad. The PTS file is the grid coordinates of your adjustment if you're working in a mapping projection. If you're working in a local project, these are the coordinates in your assumed coordinate system. Basically, whatever you see in the coordinates tab in STARNET will be in the PTS file. The GND file is what we saw in the ground tab a few minutes ago. Both of these can be edited and saved as a CSV and opened in Excel for manipulation. And the LST file contains everything we saw in the listings tab in STARNET. All 3 of these files are updated every time we press the Adjust Network button. What's next? We have a CSV of our adjusted coordinates, a KML of where those coordinates land in the real world that shows the ties that were made, and a listings file that breaks down all the information one would ever really need to know about the adjustment. I don't really love the formatting of the listings file. While comprehensive, it's not easy to read and extract usable data quickly from if you aren't familiar with STARNET. If I send this to a client or surveyor that doesn't use STARNET, they often have no idea where to start unraveling it. I want a way to send a PDF or Excel spreadsheet to a client or coworker that they can use to quickly pull any information relevant to the adjustment. To accomplish this, I made what I call an accuracy report. I make this my standard workflow for all my control network adjustments and 3D scanning jobs that utilize survey control. It includes the project information, what coordinate system and datum were used, the grid to ground metadata, what kind of observations were made and how they fit in the adjustment, the adjusted coordinates and their standard deviations. It also has a couple of other sheets for point cloud and 3D model quality control, and when all that data has been added in, a PDF is automatically created that I can send to clients that only need a brief overview of the accuracy of the project. This first page gets sent to those that need a more in-depth level of information. It really only takes another 10 to 15 minutes to compile this report and saves a lot of headaches caused by not having enough information about a set of coordinates. There's nothing worse than getting a CSV with coordinate values and no other metadata about how it was created. Is it grid to ground? What are the standard deviations of the coordinates? What datum was used? Etc., etc. I know this was one of my longer videos, and to anyone that stuck it out this long, I thank you. The intent of this video wasn't to sell anything. I'm not getting paid for this video. I'm not going to post an affiliate link. Use STARNET or don't. It won't affect me. But I do strongly suggest, if you care about your survey accuracy and hate the feeling of sending out a product without being as certain as possible that your data will stand up to criticism, use some method of least squares adjustment. It doesn't have to be STARNET, but it probably should be. I've spoken with more than a couple of employees and owners of software packages that offer competing least squares adjustment routines, and they've admitted, yeah, we can do least squares, but it's not STARNET. Now, granted, you have to buy another standalone piece of software, and wouldn't it be nice if we could just do everything in one package? Yeah, it would be. But it's like I talked about in my Nubagon video. When you get a team of really smart people focusing on one specific task, you end up with something special. Something that does exactly what it's supposed to do and does it well, with amazing customer support and constant innovation. There's a place and a time for a jack of all trades, and there's a place for being a specialist. There's a reason STARNET has been around since the 80s. I started my career using it 17 years ago, and I imagine I'll be using it in another 17 years. Well, that wraps up another video. I'm currently working on 3 different projects, so I can't be certain of exactly what my next video will be. But like I said at the start of this video, if you're local to Central Florida and want to be involved in that Traverse competition video, find me on LinkedIn and send me a message. It should be a lot of fun. I'm also putting together another head-to-head 3D scanning video with some sensors I haven't shown on my channel to date. And if you work with a 3D scanning manufacturer and would like your sensor to be included, please reach out. And finally, I recently met with a developer of a free and open source point cloud software that has some wild features in it. The fact that he created something so advanced and gave it away for free is half crazy and half generous beyond measure. I'm talking about something that should cost thousands of dollars and it's 100% free. There are some exciting topics on the horizon. Until then, thank you all for watching and subscribe if you want, like if you feel it's warranted, and I'll see you next time.